Hey there! Today we're going to dive into one of the most fundamental and life-saving skills you'll learn in instrument training, Basic Attitude Instrument Flying, or BAI. Specifically, we'll be using the control performance method. This lesson is designed to help you develop and apply precise aircraft control using only your flight instruments. You'll walk away being able to maintain straight and level flight, perform constant rate climbs and descents, make standard rate turns, and recover from unusual attitudes using a method that is proven, systematic, and dependable. For this lesson, it's important to define our objectives. So here's what you'll be able to do after today. You'll be able to explain the control performance method and scan techniques, demonstrate climbs, descents, and turns, and straight and level flight using only your instruments, recover from unusual attitudes, and use mental math to quickly estimate bank and power settings. So I'll be using the whiteboard and props as needed. So let me paint a picture. You're in simulated instrument conditions under the hood, and you're climbing out of a departure procedure. You're focused, but the turbulence kicks up, you lose track of the horizon, and your senses start to trick you. You feel like you're climbing too steeply, but your instruments are telling you otherwise. This is how real spatial disorientation begins. And it's deadly. Mastering these techniques, knowing what to trust and how to react, is what separates a safe IFR pilot from a statistic. So today, we're building your foundation to keep you in control when your senses can't. So let's talk about the control performance method. It's the bedrock of basic instrument flying and control instruments, and it's important to talk about how we manipulate control instruments directly. The attitude indicator for pitch and bank, the manifold pressure for power, RPM, performance instruments show how the airplane is responding. So that's the airspeed, altimeter, VSI, heading indicator, and turn coordinator. Now the 4 steps, and I'll draw it on the whiteboard. Establish, trim, cross-check, and adjust. This is the 4 steps of the control performance method. Now let's break it down. With establish, you set your pitch, your bank, and your power to achieve a desired performance. Use the attitude indicator to set pitch and bank. Then you set power with throttle or RPM. Now, let's talk about what you do next. You have to trim. This one is often underappreciated in instrument training, and it takes a little while to develop. A proper trim, it reduces the pilot's workload, and it prevents you from chasing the controls. So for cross-check, that's the 3rd one. You scan the performance instruments to see how the airplane is reacting to your inputs. And then you adjust. If the airplane isn't doing what you want, you simply put it in a position so that it does exactly where you want it to be, exactly what you want the airplane to be doing. And you do that with small, precise changes. That's the 4-step sequence. Now, let's talk about scanning. Good scanning is essential, and we have 2 main scan patterns. First is the inverted V. So you start at the attitude indicator, and then from that hub, you check the VSI, and from there, the turn coordinator, back to the attitude indicator, and it focuses on pitch and bank control. And there's also a circular scan, and my favorite, the hub and spoke, where you start at the attitude indicator, and from there, you look briefly up at your various elements surrounding the attitude indicator, such as your heading, your altitude, your VSI, your airspeed, and your turn coordinator, including your CDI and your RPM, but always after going to the end of the spoke, bring it back in to the hub of the attitude indicator. Now let's talk about some errors to avoid. Fixation. So students will oftentimes get stuck looking at one instrument for too long. For example, you might be staring at the heading indicator in a turn, and you might forget to monitor your altitude. With omission, you completely ignore a key instrument, like forgetting to glance at the altimeter during a descent. Emphasis is where you over-rely on one instrument. A good scenario of this is where you trust the VSI without cross-checking your airspeed or attitude indicators. Now, a knowledge test question for you. Which of the 3 common errors mentioned discusses the practice of staring at one instrument for far too long? And it's actually fixation. It's fixation. So these scanning habits must be deliberate and they must be developed early. A disciplined scan builds situational awareness, and it helps you catch and correct these errors early. So now let's talk about rules of thumb and application. All right, now let's layer in some real-world utility rules. So these will make your instrument flying more intuitive. So, for example, a 100 RPM change results in roughly 100 feet per minute of vertical speed change, and about 5 knots of airspeed change. For leveling off, you'll want to lead the level off by roughly 10% of the rate of climb or descent. So let's say you're climbing at 500 feet per minute. You can start leveling off 50 feet early. For standard rate turns, you can divide your indicated airspeed by 10 and add half of that value to find your target bank angle. And let's apply this. Let's say you're flying at 90 knots indicated airspeed, as we commonly are. 90 divided by 10 is 9, plus half of that, 4.5, gives you a standard rate bank angle of approximately 13.5 degrees. So 13 to 14 degrees in the airplane, close to 15 is where you should be. So let's draw that on the board to remember that. So remember, 100 RPM, we also have the rule of it is equal to approximately 5 knots of change. We also have roughly 100 feet per minute of change on the VSI. We also talked about the rule involving level offs of the 10% rule. And lastly, we talked about, for standard rate turns, dividing by 10. Because it's a math problem, I think it's important to write it on the board. So let's say you're at 90 knots. Let's say you're at 90 knots and you want to find your bank angle for a standard rate turn using only your instruments. And essentially, you'll have to divide that by 10. That'll give you 9. And then you take half of 9, which is 4.5. That gives you 13.5 degrees. And that is the rule for standard rate turns. All right. So this kind of mental math will help keep you ahead of the airplane. It helps with precision, especially when you're receiving vectors or doing other kinds of instrument approaches, making time-sensitive corrections. So let's tie it all together. Let's talk about how we fly these maneuvers specifically. So for straight and level flight, you'll want to use the attitude indicator to set the pitch. Then you'll want to trim out your control pressures. Scan your altimeter and VSI to maintain your altitude. And if you see a deviation, cross-check and make a small pitch or power adjustment. Now, let's talk about climbs. For climbs, you want to apply full power, raise the nose roughly 7 to 8 degrees pitch up on the attitude indicator. Then you'll trim, then you'll scan your VSI, airspeed, and adjust your pitch to maintain a steady climb. For descent, you'll want to reduce your power, usually by 100 RPM, for each 100 feet per minute desired descent rate. Then you'll want to wait for that airspeed to stabilize using the establish, trim, cross-check, adjust, control performance method that we discussed earlier. And then you'll want to lower the nose slightly. And then you'll want to trim and cross-check. And that's how you do descent. For standard rate turns, what you'll do is you'll use mental math to compute the bank angle, which we just discussed. You'll roll into your bank using the attitude indicator. And then you'll monitor your turn coordinator and your heading indicator. And you'll lead the rollout by half the bank angle to avoid overshooting your target heading. So, with that in mind, another knowledge test question for you. And your question is this. Let us say that you are rolling into your bank angle. What flight instrument should you be using what is your primary flight instrument that you're going to use when you're rolling into your bank? It's the attitude indicator. Great job. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about unusual attitude recovery. So unusual attitudes happen, and you often look down at a chart, or maybe you get distracted, and when you look up, the airplane isn't where it should be. And let's talk about some scenarios in which that could happen. Let's say you're in an airplane and it's at a nose-high attitude. Perhaps you were oscillating. Pilot-induced oscillations happen all the time, and that's what happened here. So the symptoms of it are you notice a low airspeed, you notice your altitude may be increasing, and you'll notice your high pitch attitude. And how do you recover? Well, there's a certain procedure that we follow for this, and it is first full power, wings level, and then you lower the nose. And you do it in that order always. For a nose low attitude, you'll notice that you're at a higher speed, decreasing altitude. And the recovery is you pull the power, you level the wings, and then you gradually raise the nose. So the key is you have to ensure that you follow the step-by-step procedures for getting out of unusual attitudes, because they're in place for a reason. And that reason is largely due to performance reasons, and it's so important that you follow the step-by-step procedure exactly in that order. Now, let's talk about instrument pattern 1, how you may use this. So let's say you're doing instrument pattern 1 for maybe you're practicing for a stage check, and let's talk about how you get set up for it. So I would go through a scenario with the student, if there was one right now, about how they would start straight and level and how they would get set up for that using only their instrument references at 90 knots. And then when they start the maneuver, I would talk with them about reducing to 80 knots, adjusting power, and waiting for the speed to stabilize. And then for the period where they climb at 500 feet per minute to the altitude that is specified, using the rules of thumb that we talked about, and leading the level off, as we discussed, by that 10% rule. Then I will talk about the standard rate turns to heading, computing the bank, and leading the rollout. I'd actually have them compute that bank and where they would want to lead that rollout. And lastly, I'll point to a track of section where they would want to descend at a certain feet per minute rate. And I would talk about how they would get set up for that, where they would essentially want to reduce their power, lower the nose, trim, and scan. And I would pull that up and work through that with the student. Let's run through a few live triggers. So let's say the student is told to begin a 500 feet per minute climb. I would ask the question, how do they select the correct power setting? And then I would run through a few more. So you're in a standard rate turn, and airspeed suddenly increases by 20 knots. What do you do to maintain the standard rate? And then let's say that I simulate a nose low unusual attitude. Perhaps I use this airplane. And then I would ask them what their first response would be. And I would run through their responses based on what we have already discussed. Because these scenarios are designed to teach their quick thinking, aeronautical decision making, and their ability to apply the control performance method. So now let's recap some of the common errors. So fixation, which is where you're getting locked into a one gauge solution. And the response, if you notice that you're doing that in yourself, is to verbalize your scan flow, to verbalize it. And then there is improper power settings. If you wanted to get to a 500 foot per minute, but you set the wrong RPM, the solution is to remember the 100 RPM per 100 feet per minute rule that we discussed. And then forgetting to trim. This will increase your workload and cause drift. And the solution to that is to trim after the altitude change, remembering the ETCA mnemonic. And the incorrect bank angle during turns, if you're using the incorrect bank, the solution is to compute before you roll in. And then there's poor unusual attitude recovery. The solution to that is simply memorizing the recovery steps and saying them out loud. Now, time for a conclusion. Let's wrap up what we've learned today. So the students have learned to explain and apply the control performance method and scan techniques, also having gone over some common errors associated with that. They learned to fly straight and level. They learned how to do climbs and descents and turns within tolerances based on the control performance method that we described earlier, using only their flight instruments, talking about which ones are primary for each one and the procedure that they will use. We talked about the use of power and bank rules of thumb. We talked about recovery from unusual attitudes and the importance of using the correct sequences associated with them. And we lastly recognized the scanning errors and how to correct for them, as we did in the last section, talking about how we correct. In a similar way, you might talk about hazardous attitudes and the way you correct for those. And it's important to remember that this lesson gives a stable foundation for the instrument maneuvers, for the departure approach procedures required by instrument training for holds. And if I would say to the student that if you master this, you'll be ready for anything that comes next, talking about the future involving holds, approaches, and decision-based flying in the IFR system. So with that, thank you for your attention, and next will be a lesson from a future IP and it will be a flight. Thank you.